Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the curtain on one of history's most misunderstood women, someone you think you know, but probably don't. Anne Boleyn. The woman who allegedly destroyed a marriage, wrecked a church, charmed a king into madness, and then lost her head for it. She's been called a witch, a schemer, a homewrecker, and a saint. Sometimes all in the same sentence, sometimes by the same historian. Before you get comfortable, take a quick second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a very warm, very sincere thank you to everyone who suggested Anne Boleyn as our next topic. These suggestions genuinely shape this channel, and I read every single one of them. It means more than you know. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always somehow 3 a.m. somewhere. And if you prefer to drift off with us on Spotify, the link is in the description. Now dim those lights. Turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Pull your blanket up. Get comfortable. Because tonight, we are going back to Tudor England, a place of velvet gowns, candlelit plotting, and enough backstabbing to fill several Netflix series. Here's what I want you to think about as you settle in. Did Anne Boleyn actually seduce a king? Or was she just inconveniently intelligent in a century that hated that? Did she break up a royal marriage? Or was it already well on its way off a cliff? Was she guilty of the crimes that cost her her head? Or was she simply inconvenient to the wrong man at the wrong moment? Was Henry VIII a tragic romantic or a moody tyrant who used women like chess pieces and then flipped the board when he was losing? And perhaps most importantly, if Anne Boleyn had been born 500 years later, would she have been unstoppable, or would she have simply had a very chaotic podcast? Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1533. You're standing in the English court. The air smells of beeswax candles, expensive wool, and political anxiety. Someone across the room is whispering about you, and the king, enormous, red-faced, very much married to someone else, is looking directly at you with a very inconvenient expression. Good luck. Let's start at the beginning, which, in Anne Boleyn's case, is one of the great historical mysteries of the Tudor era. No one recorded the date. No one thought to write it down, because nobody in 1501 or thereabouts looked at the newborn daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a moderately ambitious diplomat with good cheekbones and better connections, and thought that one is going to change England forever. She was born, most historians now agree, somewhere between 1501 and 1507, probably at Blickling Hall in Norfolk or Hever Castle in Kent, into a family that was comfortable but not extraordinary. Her mother was Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman from genuinely impressive stock. The Howards were one of England's great aristocratic families, the kind who had portraits painted and enemies made. Her father Thomas was sharp, socially agile, and relentlessly upwardly mobile in the way that only men in Tudor courts could be, all polished manners and concealed desperation. Anne was not the eldest. She was not the male heir. She was, in the cold accounting of 16th century England, precisely the kind of child a family invested in just enough to make her useful. And yet from the very start, something about Anne Boleyn refused to sit quietly in its assigned place. She grew up at Hever Castle, a modest but pleasant moated manor in Kent, surrounded by the rhythms of a gentry household, servants, horses, lessons, seasonal hunts, and the constant low hum of her father's social ambitions. Thomas Boleyn was relentlessly focused on advancement, and he was good at it. He spoke French and Latin, he knew how to present himself at court, and he understood that in Tudor England, children, even daughters, were a form of currency if handled correctly. Anne and her sister Mary were assets to be deployed. Their brother George was the heir. The girls were the investment portfolio. What distinguished Anne from the beginning, according to those who knew her in later years and looked back, was her mind. not in some vague, flattering way, but with a specific, restless quality that made her difficult to manage and impossible to ignore. She asked questions, she retained what she read, she had opinions about things girls were not particularly invited to have opinions about. In another century, in another country, in another set of circumstances, she might have been a scholar. In Tudor England, she was a problem to be solved through advantageous placement. Her childhood was not unusual for her class. She would have learned to read, to sew, to play music, to conduct herself at table with appropriate grace. She would have attended chapel and learned her catechism. She would have watched how her mother moved through a household, how her father navigated a court, absorbing the grammar of power the way children absorb language, not by being taught it directly, but by living inside it. The world she grew up in was one where a woman's worth was measured almost entirely by what she could provide through marriage and childbearing, and where the gap between her actual capabilities and what she was permitted to do with them was roughly the size of the English Channel. And yet someone, her father most likely calculating as ever, looked at this sharp, restless, linguistically gifted girl and made a decision that would reshape history. He sent her abroad. Not to be married off quietly to a Kent landowner, not to be tucked into a convent. Abroad, to the most sophisticated courts in Europe, to places where clever women were occasionally allowed to be something other than decorative. It was the best and most consequential thing Thomas Boleyn ever did. He did it entirely for his own reasons. History got the benefit anyway. Most girls of Anne's background were destined for a fairly predictable circuit. Educated at home, married off strategically, absorbed into a husband's household, and thereafter mentioned in historical records primarily in the context of childbearing. Anne Boleyn did not get that trajectory, and it is entirely possible the world would have been a duller place if she had. Instead, at around 12 or 13 years old, an age when most of us were just discovering how to be profoundly embarrassing, Anne was dispatched to the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands. Margaret was one of the most formidable women in Europe, a ruler, a diplomat, a patron of the arts, and a woman who had survived enough personal tragedy to stock a soap opera for several seasons. Anne arrived in Mechlin squinting through the cultural shock of a foreign court, and immediately began learning something no English finishing school could have taught her: how power actually worked when women were holding it. Margaret of Austria was the regent of the Netherlands, governing on behalf of her nephew, the young Charles, who would later become the Holy Roman Emperor and, in a twist of historical irony, the man whose political leverage over the Pope would make Anne's own marriage to Henry VIII enormously complicated. But in 1513, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Anne found herself in a court where women held real authority, where the arts were taken seriously, where music and painting and literature were not merely decorative but central to how power presented itself to the world. Margaret herself was a noted art collector, a skilled musician, and a political operator of considerable sophistication. She took a liking to young Anne, reportedly writing to Thomas Boleyn that his daughter was so presentable and so pleasant in her manner that Margaret had quite forgotten she was English. This is, when you think about it, a remarkable thing to put in a letter. It was essentially a report card that said, "Your daughter is extraordinary. Please do not waste her." Anne spent roughly a year in the Netherlands before her father arranged for her to move to France, where she would spend the better part of the next 7 years. But that year in Mechlin did something to her that cannot be measured precisely, but can be felt in everything that came afterward. She watched a woman govern a country. She watched a woman make decisions about art and politics and diplomacy, and she watched the men around that woman defer to her judgment. She filed this information away. She also began seriously to learn French, the language that would become her second tongue and one of her most important political tools. French at a 16th century court was not merely a social nicety. It was the language of diplomacy, of sophisticated intellectual discourse, of the new humanist scholarship that was reshaping how educated Europeans thought about everything from religion to governance. To speak it fluently was to have access to a whole world of ideas that English alone could not unlock. Anne arrived in the Netherlands as Thomas Boleyn's quiet investment. She left it something distinctly her own, a young woman who had seen what was possible and who had no intention of settling for less. If Margaret of Austria's court was Anne's introduction to sophisticated power, the French court was where she learned to weaponize it. Anne spent the better part of her teenage years in France, first serving Queen Claude, the gentle, overlooked wife of the notoriously charismatic King Francis I, and later moving in the intellectual orbit of Marguerite of Navarre, a woman of dazzling learning and reformist religious leanings. France in the 15-teens was arguably the most intellectually electric place in Europe. New ideas about religion, governance, and the role of women in public life were circulating in salons and court chambers with the dangerous energy of sparks near dry straw. Anne absorbed all of it. She became fluent in French, not textbook fluent, but genuinely, effortlessly fluent, the kind that lets you make jokes and insult people with elegance. She learned to dance in the French style, to dress in the French style, to move through a room with the particular confidence of someone who has been told that conversation is itself an art form. The French court under Francis I was a genuinely remarkable environment. Francis was a Renaissance king in the fullest sense, a patron of Leonardo da Vinci, a collector of Italian art, a man who believed that the elegance of a court was a form of political statement. His court glittered. It was also, like all courts, a place of relentless competition, concealed ambition, and very sharp knives wrapped in very fine silk. Anne learned to navigate all of it. She learned that wit was currency. She learned that a well-timed silence could accomplish more than an argument. She learned to read a room, to understand who wanted what, who feared whom, and where the actual lines of power ran beneath the decorative surface of ceremony and flattery. She served Queen Claude for several years, and Claude's household, pious, reserved, somewhat apart from the louder energies of Francis's court, gave Anne a grounding in dignity and composure. But it was the influence of Marguerite of Navarre that left the deepest mark. Marguerite was Francis's sister, one of the most educated women of her generation, a poet and writer of genuine originality, and a figure deeply sympathetic to the new religious reformism that was beginning to rattle the foundations of the Catholic Church. She read Erasmus. She corresponded with reformers. She protected thinkers who were being persecuted for questioning church doctrine. Anne, in her orbit, began to develop the theological and intellectual convictions that would drive much of her later political life. There is something almost poignant about imagining Anne at 15, 16, 17, at those ages when most of us were busy making decisions we would later describe as character building, moving through the French court, watching, learning, forming opinions about scripture and governance, and the proper responsibilities of rulers. She was being educated, in the most comprehensive possible sense, for a life she could not yet have imagined. When she finally returned to England, she was not the girl who had left. She was something the English court had not quite seen before, a woman shaped by the most sophisticated courts in Europe, fluent in French, steeped in reformist ideas, comfortable in her own authority, and possessed of a quality that contemporaries struggle to name but consistently described: a presence. Something that made people look at her and then keep looking. It wasn't beauty, exactly. It was something that cannot be embroidered onto a gown or learned from a deportment teacher. It was the particular confidence of someone who had been given, by accident and design, a genuinely exceptional education, and who knew exactly what to do with it. Anne returned to England sometime in the early 1520s, and the English court looked at her the way a very polite gathering of slightly damp people looks at someone who has just walked in from a fireworks display. She was different, noticeably, disconcertingly different. Where English courtly women were expected to be modest and decorative, Anne was sharp. Where they were quiet, she was witty. Where they dressed in the muted heavy fabrics of English fashion, she had absorbed the bolder colours and lighter silhouettes of the French court. She was not considered conventionally beautiful by Tudor standards. She was dark where fairness was prized, angular where softness was preferred, and she had a certain extra fingernail on one hand that her enemies would later try to use as evidence of witchcraft, because of course they did. But she was magnetic. Observers noted her dark, luminous eyes and her ability to hold a room's attention without appearing to try. She joined the household of Queen Catherine of Aragon as a maid of honour, a position of proximity to power, and immediately began making an impression that some found dazzling and others found deeply irritating. The English court she returned to was not, it must be said, a boring place. Henry VIII was in his early 30s, at the height of his physical and intellectual powers, presiding over a court that was trying very hard to compete with the glamour of France and the cultural prestige of the Italian city-states. There was music, there was poetry, there were elaborate dramatic entertainments called masques, in which courtiers performed allegorical roles in costumes of considerable ambition. Henry himself participated enthusiastically. He was a gifted musician, a competent poet, and an athlete of genuine ability, who still jousted and hunted with the energy of a man who believed he would be young forever. Into this world came Anne Boleyn, and she moved through it like someone who had seen the original and could tell the difference. Her French was flawless. Theirs was studied. Her dancing had the quality that French training produces and English training does not quite replicate. She engaged in the wit games and verbal sparring of court life with an ease that made others look rehearsed. She had opinions, expressed with the directness of someone who had spent years in environments where the quality of an argument mattered, and she expressed them without the apologetic softening that was considered appropriate in women. She was also, for a period, involved with Henry Percy, the young heir to the Earl of Northumberland, a genuine romantic attachment that was broken up at Cardinal Wolsey's intervention, almost certainly on Henry VIII's orders, once the king's own interest in Anne had been roused. Anne never forgot this. Percy was quickly married off to someone else. Anne was left with the particular bitter knowledge of someone whose personal life had been dismantled by forces entirely outside her control, a lesson in how thoroughly power could reach into even the most private corners. The court watched all of this with the focused attention of people with very little else to do. Gossip was the great recreational industry of Tudor England, and Anne Boleyn, from her first appearance back in the English court, was excellent material. Some admired her openly, some resented her instinctively, the English suspicion of things that were too French, too polished, too clever running just beneath the surface of the flattery, and some, watching the king watch her with that particular quality of attention, understood that something significant was beginning to move. Anne herself understood it better than anyone. She had returned from France educated in power. Now she was standing at the centre of the most powerful court in England, and the most powerful man in that court was looking at her with an expression she recognised. The question was what to do about it. Here is a thing that Tudor courtiers understood with the bone-deep certainty of people who had watched it happen to others. Catching the king's eye was both the best and worst thing that could happen to a woman. Henry VIII, in the early 1520s, was still the golden version of himself, the broad-shouldered, intellectually curious, athletically gifted monarch who had charmed all of Europe when he took the throne at 17. He was also already well practiced in the business of royal flirtation. Before Anne, there had been her own sister, Mary Boleyn, who'd been Henry's mistress for a period without it changing her social status in any permanent way, or, crucially, without her ending up on a scaffold. The king's attention was like an open fire, warming if you were positioned correctly, catastrophic if you weren't. Anne knew this. She'd grown up watching her sister navigate it, and yet when Henry's interest turned toward her, somewhere around 1525 or 1526, Anne made a decision that was either the shrewdest or most reckless move in Tudor history, depending on which historian you ask. She said no, this needs a moment to land properly. Henry VIII said, "I would like you to be my mistress." He was the King of England. He had absolute power, enormous wealth, and the ability to make almost any problem disappear. He was also, at this point, still married to Catherine of Aragon, which meant that the position of royal mistress was, in Tudor terms, the most a woman in Anne's position could reasonably aspire to. Mary Boleyn had accepted it. Several women before Mary had accepted it. It was understood to be the ceiling, and Anne looked at this ceiling and said, "No thank you, I will not be a mistress. If you want me, you will make me your wife." Think about what this required. It required a level of self-possession so extraordinary it borders on the incomprehensible. It required her to look at a king, a physically imposing, famously volatile, enormously powerful king who was not accustomed to being denied anything, and hold her ground. It required her to calculate correctly that Henry's interest was strong enough to survive being refused, that the refusal, rather than cooling his ardour, would intensify it, that she could leverage his obsession into a negotiating position. She was right. But being right did not make the situation less dangerous. Every day that she maintained her position, holding Henry at arm's length, allowing the romantic tension to build without releasing it, she was walking a wire over a very long drop. Henry's moods were not stable. His affections were not reliable. Men and women had lost everything at Tudor court for far smaller offences than telling the king no. There were people around Anne who thought she was mad. There were people who thought she was brilliant. There were probably moments when Anne herself was not entirely sure which one it was. What she seems to have understood, and this is the part that gets lost in the romantic version of the story, is that being a royal mistress was not safety. It was the illusion of safety. Mary Boleyn had been Henry's mistress, and then she'd been set aside, and then she had been married off, and then she had been largely forgotten. Anne did not want to be forgotten. She wanted something that could not be taken away, without legal and political machinery being brought to bear, and the only thing that qualified in Tudor England was a crown. So she held out for a crown, and in doing so she set in motion a sequence of events that would break England's relationship with Rome, reshape the religious landscape of Northern Europe, and end with her own head on a scaffold. Sometimes being right is its own kind of catastrophe. Henry VIII was not by reputation a man accustomed to being told no. He was a king. He was enormous. He had opinions about theology that entire countries would later be restructured to accommodate. And yet somewhere between 1526 and 1528, he wrote Anne Boleyn a series of love letters so desperate, so unguarded, so nakedly emotional that historians have been quietly astonished by them ever since. 17 of these letters survive in the Vatican Library of all places, where they ended up under circumstances that remain a historical mystery, and they are not the letters of a man in control. They are the letters of someone in full romantic freefall. Henry addressed Anne as his only mistress, his heart, the woman without whom life held no sweetness. He complained when she didn't respond quickly. He promised her things. He worried that she was avoiding him. He sent her venison from a hunt with a note explaining the symbolism of the deer in a way that suggests he'd been lying awake thinking about it. These are not the calculated dispatches of a powerful man managing a situation. They are the texts of someone who has lost the plot entirely. These letters are remarkable documents for several reasons. First, because Henry was not generally given to emotional vulnerability. He was a king who projected strength, who surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear, who had the luxury of never having to negotiate with his own feelings because everything around him was arranged to accommodate them. And yet here he is, in these letters, essentially pleading, asking Anne why she hasn't written, wondering if she's well, describing the agony of uncertainty, whether she returns his feelings, whether she intends to remain cold to him, whether his suit has any hope at all. Second, because Anne's responses, or rather the absence of her responses in the surviving record, since none of Anne's letters to Henry from this period survive, is itself revealing. The 17 letters are all from Henry to Anne, not the reverse. This is probably not an accident. Anne appears to have been extremely careful about what she committed to writing, and extremely deliberate about the pace and content of her communications to the king. Where Henry is pouring himself out across the page, Anne is measured, controlled, giving him just enough to keep the fire burning without giving him anything that could be used against her. Third, and this is the part that should probably make everyone feel slightly strange, Henry explicitly offered to make Anne his official mistress in these letters, in writing, with a kind of Baroque romantic framing that was fashionable at the time. He used the language of courtly love to frame what was, essentially, a very powerful man lobbying a woman to accept a position of informal sexual availability. And Anne, reading these letters in her chambers at Hervey or at court, is thought to have declined this offer also in writing, though her response does not survive, while leaving enough warmth in her reply to keep Henry engaged. This is a masterclass in emotional intelligence that would be impressive in any century. In the 16th century, from a woman who had almost no legal standing and no formal power, it is extraordinary. The letters tell us that Henry was, for a period of years, genuinely in love, or something so close to love that the distinction didn't matter, and that Anne, whatever she felt, understood that emotion was a tool and used it with precision. The phrase, "the king's great matter," is how Tudor-era diplomats politely described the situation of a monarch who had decided his marriage to his devout, dignified, politically powerful wife was actually invalid, and that God would probably be fine with him remarrying a woman 18 years his junior who had told him no for 2 years. Catherine of Aragon had been married to Henry since 1509. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the aunt of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and by all accounts a genuinely capable, gracious and beloved queen. She had also endured a string of pregnancies that resulted in only one surviving child, Mary, and Henry had convinced himself, or was being helped to convince himself, that this was divine punishment for the sin of marrying his dead brother's wife. The argument was complex, loyally, and largely unconvincing to everyone except Henry, who had found it extremely convincing the moment Anne Boleyn appeared in his peripheral vision. Here is the theological argument Henry was making, stripped of its elaborate scaffolding. His brother Arthur had briefly been married to Catherine in 1501. Arthur died a few months later, possibly without the marriage ever being consummated. Catherine always maintained it had not been. Henry's father, Henry VII, anxious not to return Catherine's substantial dowry to Spain, arranged for young Henry to marry her instead, with special papal dispensation granted to permit the union. For nearly 20 years the marriage worked well enough. Catherine was a capable consort. Henry had his mistresses and didn't trouble her about them. They had one surviving child. Life proceeded. But dynasties ran on male heirs, and Henry had none. And when he encountered Anne Boleyn, and began to contemplate the possibility of a different future, he found himself in urgent need of a theological basis for ending his marriage. The book of Leviticus provided one. It prohibited a man from marrying his brother's wife. Henry seized on this with the enthusiasm of someone who had been looking for exactly this verse and was thrilled to find it. He announced to his wife, to his court, to the Pope, to Europe, that his marriage to Catherine had been invalid from the start. The papal dispensation had been issued in error. The 20 years of marriage were void. He wanted an annulment. What followed was one of the most protracted and embarrassing diplomatic fiascos of the 16th century. Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's chief minister and the most powerful churchman in England, was dispatched to handle the annulment negotiations. He failed, partly because he was not talented enough, but mostly because the situation was genuinely impossible. Pope Clement VII was in an extraordinarily difficult position: grant the annulment and humiliate the Holy Roman Emperor, or refuse it and humiliate the King of England. He chose to do neither, which is to say he chose to do nothing, issuing delays and procedural complications with the creativity of someone who understood that any decision would be a disaster, and was therefore committed to making no decision at all. Wolsey, caught between a pope who wouldn't move and a king who was losing patience, eventually fell from grace entirely, stripped of his offices, accused of treason, and dead before he could be tried. Henry wanted his marriage ended. The great matter was just getting started. One of the most quietly extraordinary figures in this entire story is the woman Anne was replacing, or, more accurately, failing to replace quietly, because Catherine of Aragon turned out to be made of something considerably tougher than anyone anticipated. Catherine's position was, on paper, precarious. The Pope had to annul her marriage for her to be removed legally, and the Pope, Clement VII, was at this particular historical moment essentially a political prisoner of Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, who had just sacked Rome and was in no mood to help the King of England discard his aunt. Catherine understood this. She also understood English law, church doctrine, and the value of public sympathy, and she used all three with the quiet brilliance of someone who had been navigating hostile courts since childhood. She refused to call herself anything other than Queen. She refused to accept annulment proceedings as valid. She wrote to Rome, to Charles, to anyone who would listen, making her case with such calm and articulate precision that even Henry's own advisers occasionally had to suppress their admiration. It is worth dwelling on who Catherine was before she became the woman Anne Boleyn was replacing, because the reduction of Catherine to wronged wife flattens someone genuinely remarkable. She was the daughter of Isabella of Castile, one of the most capable rulers in European history, the woman who had sponsored Columbus and expelled the Moors from Spain. Catherine had been raised as a princess of a major European power, educated in Latin and theology and statecraft, prepared from birth for the political weight of a royal marriage. She had been Queen of England, effectively, for nearly 20 years. During Henry's absence on campaign in France in 1513, she had served as regent and overseen the English victory against the Scots at Flodden, writing to Henry afterward with what can only be described as barely contained excitement, enclosing a piece of the dead Scottish king's coat as a souvenir. This was not a woman who had spent her life being ornamental, and so when Henry told her, somewhat awkwardly in 1527, that he had come to believe their marriage had never been valid and that he intended to pursue an annulment, Catherine responded with the clarity of someone who had been expecting trouble and had prepared for it. She said the marriage was valid. She said she would not voluntarily give it up. She said she was Henry's true wife before God and before England. And then she said this in public to an audience of legal and ecclesiastical authorities assembled to hear her case in a speech that contemporaries recorded with visible admiration. She had come to this country as a stranger, she said. She'd been a true and loyal wife. She commended her cause to God, and she walked out. Henry never quite got over this. He had expected compliance. He had not expected Catherine to fight methodically and brilliantly for years. She appealed to Rome. She maintained her household as a queen. She refused to relinquish her title. When Henry finally had Archbishop Cranmer declare the marriage annulled in 1533, without Rome's approval by this point, Catherine continued calling herself Queen until her death in January 1536. She was separated from her daughter Mary, denied access, reduced in household and stripped of her title, and she simply ignored all of it. She was called the Princess Dowager, the widow of Prince Arthur, and she refused the name every single time. Here is the part of Anne Boleyn's story that gets left out of most of the romantic drama versions. She was, by the standards of early 16th century England, genuinely and seriously interested in religious reform. While Henry was initially pursuing the annulment largely for personal reasons wrapped in theological language, Anne had real intellectual convictions about the direction Christianity should take. Convictions she had absorbed in France, where the ideas of Erasmus, Lefebvre d'Etaples, and eventually Luther were circulating with a kind of dangerous excitement. Anne owned books that were on the Church's prohibited list. She lent them to Henry. She had a copy of William Tyndale's English translation of the New Testament, a book for which people were being burned at the time, annotated in the margins. She advocated for church reform to Henry not as a political manoeuvre, but as someone who had thought about it, read about it, and believed in it. She promoted reformist clergymen into positions of influence. She used her proximity to the king to push for changes that she thought genuinely mattered. This is, if you stop and think about it, remarkable. Anne Boleyn was doing this in the 1520s and early 1530s at a time when Henry VIII was still, technically, fidei defensor, defender of the faith, a title the Pope had given him for writing a pamphlet attacking Luther. The English Church was Catholic. The burning of Protestant reformers was not yet a daily event in England, but it was not unheard of. To possess a copy of Tyndale's Bible, a translation made by a man who had fled England to avoid prosecution, and who would eventually be strangled and burned for his beliefs on the continent, was not a minor act of intellectual curiosity. It was a statement. Anne appears to have genuinely believed that access to scripture in English was a good thing, that ordinary people should be able to read the Bible in their own language rather than depending on Latin-speaking clergy to mediate between them and the Word of God. This was a position that Tyndale argued powerfully, and that the Catholic Church considered deeply threatening, and for good reason, since the ability to read scripture independently tended to produce people who asked awkward questions about why church doctrine required quite so many expensive mediators. Anne pushed this position with Henry, apparently with some success. He came to share, at least in part, her enthusiasm for an English Bible, and the eventual production and distribution of the Great Bible in 1539, just 3 years after Anne's death, owes something to the intellectual groundwork she laid. She also used her influence to protect and advance specific people. Hugh Latimer, who would later become one of the most important Protestant reformers of the 16th century, owed his rise in significant part to Anne's patronage. Nicholas Shaxton, another reformist bishop, was similarly supported by her. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who would grant Henry the annulment he needed, and who would go on to shape the theology and liturgy of the Church of England, was someone Anne had helped promote. She was not simply a passive beneficiary of the Reformation. She was, in her particular way, a maker of it, which makes the later Catholic portrayal of her as a self-serving schemer who used religion as a political tool feel, when examined closely, less like history and more like a very convenient story told by people who found her inconvenient. When Henry VIII finally ran out of patience with the Pope's refusal to grant his annulment and decided to simply declare himself the supreme head of the Church of England, it was one of the most consequential political acts in the history of these islands, and it happened in large part because a woman from Kent had declined to be a royal mistress. The break with Rome was not something Anne engineered as a power grab, though her enemies would say so. It was the result of years of increasingly frantic legal manoeuvring, diplomatic failures, and a king who had worked himself into a position where he could not back down without losing face on a continental scale. Thomas Cranmer, whom Anne had helped promote, became Archbishop of Canterbury and granted the annulment Henry needed. Thomas Cromwell, the administrative genius who would later destroy Anne, helped engineer the legal architecture of the break. And in the spring of 1533, Henry and Anne were finally and officially married, with Anne already pregnant with the child they were both certain would be a son. The break with Rome did not happen all at once. It was a series of acts of Parliament, each one ratcheting England further from the Catholic Church in a way that was partly ideological and partly just the legal consequence of needing to get a marriage annulled without the Pope's cooperation. The Act in Restraint of Appeals in 1533 prevented appeals to Rome. Specifically, it was designed to prevent Catherine from appealing her case there, but its implications were enormous. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 formally made Henry the supreme head of the Church of England, replacing the Pope's authority in England with the King's own. The Treason Act the same year made it a capital offence to deny the King's supremacy, which meant that anyone who refused to accept the new arrangement could be executed for it, and several people were, including Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher. These were not small events. England had been Catholic for nearly 1,000 years. The structures of daily life, the church calendar, the prayers, the sacraments, the monasteries and convents that served as hospitals and schools and social safety nets were all Catholic in their architecture. To break from Rome was to set in motion a process of religious and social disruption that would take generations to resolve, that would produce civil war, that would shape English national identity in ways still visible in the 21st century. None of this was what Henry thought he was doing when he started pursuing Anne. He thought he was getting a new wife and hopefully a son. He ended up restructuring the spiritual foundations of an entire country. Anne had not planned this either, but she had the theological convictions to understand it, and the intelligence to recognise as it unfolded that it was larger than any one marriage, any one annulment, any one king's desire. She had wanted a crown. She got one. And the world that existed when she received it was permanently different from the one she'd grown up in. The coronation of Anne Boleyn on the 1st of June 1533 was one of the most elaborate spectacles the English court had staged in a generation, and also, by almost all contemporary accounts, one of the most atmospherically uncomfortable. The people of London turned out to watch, but the cheering was noticeably thin. Some in the crowd were seen wearing Catherine of Aragon's initials as a quiet act of defiance. Others reportedly made rude noises at the wrong moments. The new queen processed through the city in white and gold, her dark hair loose under her crown, visibly pregnant, attempting to project the serene authority of an established monarch, while the city watched with expressions ranging from polite enthusiasm to barely concealed scepticism. And yet Anne herself on that day was whatever the opposite of fragile is. She had waited 7 years for this. She had watched a pope dither, a king rage, an empire threaten and a court fracture. She had been called names that don't bear repeating. She had been compared, unfavourably and in public, to a horse dealer's wife. And here she was, crowned, anointed, and carrying what she and every person in England believed was the future king. The coronation ceremonies stretched across several days, a procession through London on the Saturday, the ceremony itself at Westminster Abbey on Whit Sunday, and a banquet of the kind that only Tudor England could produce. involving quantities of food that suggest a deep institutional anxiety about running out. Anne rode through the streets in a litter of white cloth of gold, surrounded by the great lords of England and attended by ladies in scarlet. The city had been decorated, pageants had been staged along the route, complimentary verses had been composed. Everything that ceremony and money could do to make this moment feel legitimate and magnificent had been done, and yet the atmosphere was off. Contemporary accounts note that the crowds were smaller than expected, and quieter than they should have been. Several observers recorded that people failed to doff their caps as Anne passed, a small but pointed act of disrespect in a world where such gestures were loaded with meaning. Someone in the crowd called out "Ha! Ha!" mockingly at the initials H.A., Henry and Anne, that had been embroidered and carved everywhere. The Londoners who adored Catherine of Aragon, who had shouted for her in the streets and wept at the reports of her treatment, did not simply transfer their loyalties to her replacement because the replacement had now been crowned. Anne is said to have maintained her composure throughout, though those close to her noted the effort it cost. She knew the city was not with her. She knew that the image of Catherine, dignified, wronged, beloved, stood between her and the public affection she needed. She could not dismantle that image by decree. She could only proceed, and hope that time and a male heir would do the work that ceremony could not. Inside Westminster Abbey, the ancient ritual unfolded with all its sacred weight. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, Anne's man, the man she'd helped raise to precisely this position, placed St. Edward's crown on her head. She was anointed with holy oil on her head and breast. She was presented with the orb, the sceptre, and the rod of ivory, the symbolic tools of royal sovereignty. She became, in that moment, not just the king's wife, but a queen in her own right, anointed before God, invested with the sacred authority of the English crown. It was the thing she had aimed for across 7 years of extraordinary effort, and it had cost everything she had. The question now was whether it would hold. On the 7th of September, 1533, at Greenwich Palace, Anne Boleyn gave birth to a daughter. The royal astrologers had predicted a boy. The letters announcing the birth had been pre-drafted with masculine pronouns. The jousting tournament Henry had planned to celebrate the arrival of his son had to be quietly cancelled. The baby was healthy, alert, and by all accounts perfect, but she was not the heir Henry needed, and the court knew it immediately with the particular uncomfortable silence of people trying to find something genuinely kind to say. Anne named her Elizabeth, after both her own mother and Henry's mother. She presented the child with grace and committed publicly to having a son next. Henry, who had dismantled the religious structure of an entire country for this moment, made the appropriate noises and looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who has been told the restaurant is out of the dish. He drove an hour to order. Anne understood the stakes. She understood them more clearly than anyone. The birth of Elizabeth was not, in the immediate term, catastrophic. Henry was disappointed, but not yet unravelling. He had a daughter, which was something. More importantly, the pregnancy had proved Anne was fertile, that the machinery was working, and the son would presumably follow. Elizabeth was removed to her own household at Hatfield, which was standard practice for royal children and provided with a proper establishment. Henry visited occasionally. He did not visit often. What the birth of Elizabeth did more than anything was start the clock. Tudor political arithmetic was unforgiving. A queen who had not produced a male heir was a queen on borrowed time. This was not personal, or not only personal, it was structural. The entire point of the annulment, the break with Rome, the humiliation of Catherine, the restructuring of English religious life had been to produce a legitimate male heir. A daughter, however healthy and bright, was not that. She was evidence that God had not yet blessed the new marriage in the way that mattered most. Anne threw herself into motherhood with the intensity she brought to everything. She insisted on nursing Elizabeth herself for a period, an unusual choice for a queen who would normally hand the child immediately to a wet nurse, apparently because she was reluctant to let the child out of her sight. She took an active interest in Elizabeth's household, her attendance, her care. There was in this something that goes beyond royal duty, a particular ferocity that reads like a woman who understood, perhaps better than she admitted consciously, that this child was her most important creation and her most durable legacy. Henry, meanwhile, was being Henry. He continued to express affection for Anne publicly and to commit to the marriage. But the fissures were beginning. The pressure of producing an heir, combined with the ongoing political turbulence of this break with Rome and the mounting hostility of European powers, was making him irritable in ways that had nowhere safe to go. Anne, who had never been a woman to absorb difficulty quietly, argued back. The court noted with the attentiveness of people who understood that the temperature of the royal marriage directly affected their own fortunes, that the exchanges between king and queen were sometimes sharp. The honeymoon, such as it had been, was already shortening. What did it mean to be Queen of England in the 1530s? Let's set aside the crowns and the portraits for a moment, because the day-to-day reality of Anne Boleyn's queenship was considerably more complicated than the romanticised version suggests. She ran a large household. She managed patronage networks, deciding who got positions, who got a support in preferment, who she would advocate for to the king. She was expected to be publicly pious, privately charming, perpetually fertile, and never visibly anxious, regardless of the fact that her political position depended entirely on producing a male heir, while her predecessor's supporters were loudly wishing for her downfall from every corner of England. She threw herself into the role with the driven intensity of someone who had spent 7 years preparing for it. She was a significant patron of reformist religious causes. She pushed for better translation and distribution of scripture. She interceded for people in financial or legal difficulty with the kind of quiet effectiveness that doesn't make it into the dramatic retellings. A queen's household in Tudor England was a substantial operation. Anne's establishment at its height included over 250 people. Ladies-in-waiting, gentlewomen, chaplains, musicians, physicians, cooks, grooms, and the entire administrative apparatus required to run what was effectively a small mobile city attached to the king's court. Managing this required organisational capacity, social intelligence, and the ability to navigate rivalries and resentments among people who had been placed in the household for political reasons and did not always like each other, or, for that matter, like Anne. She was not universally loved by her ladies. Some were Catherine of Aragon's partisans. Some were there because their families needed the access she represented. Some genuinely admired her. The household was a microcosm of the court itself, all competing interests wrapped in velvet and good manners. Patronage was one of the most important tools available to a Tudor queen, and Anne used it with strategic intent. She promoted reformist clergymen, as we've noted, but she also used her influence to support scholars, writers, and artists. She had genuine aesthetic interests. She was musical. She appreciated fine books and manuscripts, and she had the taste that her years in the French court had developed. Her household was a place where new religious and intellectual ideas circulated more freely than in many other parts of the English establishment. She also interceded, formally and informally, on behalf of people who needed the king's mercy or favour. Tudor queens were expected to perform this function, the gracious intercessor softening the hard edges of royal power, and Anne did it with evident genuine commitment. There are records of her advocating for the poor, for tenants displaced by the dissolution of the monasteries, for individuals caught in the grinding gears of the legal system. This is not the portrait of a woman consumed by vanity and ambition. It is the portrait of a woman doing a genuinely difficult job with considerable skill, while simultaneously managing the existential pressure of knowing that all of it, the household, the patronage, the influence, the crown itself, rested on her ability to produce a son. It is, honestly, exhausting just to describe. The idea that Anne Boleyn was primarily a schemer who got what she deserved misses something essential. She was doing the work. Under impossible conditions, with enemies on every side, she was doing the work of a queen, and she was good at it. Between 1534 and 1536, Anne Boleyn suffered multiple pregnancy losses. The exact number is debated by historians, but the pattern is clear and devastating. After Elizabeth, she conceived again, and appears to have miscarried. She conceived again. In January 1536, while Catherine of Aragon was dying and Henry was jousting and apparently feeling invulnerable, Anne miscarried what contemporaries described as a boy of around 15 weeks. This loss, coming at the worst possible political moment, coinciding with Henry's growing interest in Jane Seymour, and landing in the court of a man who had already demonstrated his capacity to declare marriages invalid and start fresh, was catastrophic. Anne's position had always rested on a foundation of future promise. She would give Henry the son he needed. She just needed time and luck and divine favour. Each miscarriage was not only a personal tragedy, but a political one, evidence, in the minds of her enemies, and increasingly in Henry's own superstitious, mercurial mind, that the marriage itself might be cursed. The January 1536 miscarriage deserves particular attention because it happened on the same day as Catherine of Aragon's funeral, a coincidence of timing so starkly ironic that even by Tudor standards it stands out. Henry, rather than offering comfort, is reported to have visited Anne's bedside and said something that has been variously reported, but amounts, in all versions, to a cold declaration that he could see God would not give him male children by her. This is, to put it plainly, an appalling thing to say to a woman who has just miscarried. It is also, in the context of what was about to happen, something more sinister than mere insensitivity. It reads, in retrospect, like a man preparing a narrative. Anne apparently responded, according to one account, by blaming the miscarriage on the shock of seeing Henry throw a woman from his horse at a joust, and by saying she had carried the child in distress over his treatment of her. Whether or not this is precisely accurate, it tells us something about the state of the marriage in early 1536. It was a marriage in which a woman who had just lost a pregnancy felt the need to defend herself to the man who should have been comforting her. What would a miscarriage in the 16th century actually have been like? There were no hospitals, no pain management, no understanding of the physiological processes involved beyond the most rudimentary observation. A woman who miscarried was tended by her ladies, and possibly a midwife, in her chambers, without any of the medical framework that modern understanding provides. The physical experience was brutal. The emotional experience was compounded by the knowledge that a miscarriage was publicly significant in a way that most private grief is not, that every person at court knew what had happened, was calculating its implications, and was watching Anne's face for signs of weakness or despair. She did not show them. Or rather, she showed as little as she could. She returned to public duties as quickly as she was physically able. She committed again to producing a son. She managed her household, maintained her patronage networks, and continued advocating for her causes. From the outside, she looked like a queen. From the inside, she must have known the walls were moving. If Anne Boleyn had enemies in the Tudor court, she had plenty of them, and most of them were simply reactionary conservatives who resented her reformist influence and her French manners and her refusal to be invisible. But the man who ultimately destroyed her was someone who had once been her ally, Thomas Cromwell, the blacksmith's son from Putney, who had clawed his way up to become Henry's chief minister and the most powerful non-royal in England. Cromwell and Anne had worked in rough parallel during the early reform years, he providing the administrative and legal architecture for the break with Rome, she providing ideological direction and the royal ear. But by 1535 and 36, their interest had diverged sharply. Anne wanted Reformation proceeds, the money from the dissolved monasteries, redirected toward education and charitable causes. Cromwell wanted that money for the crown and for the patronage networks that kept him powerful. They clashed. Anne was not subtle about it. Cromwell is one of the genuinely fascinating figures of the Tudor period, a man of extraordinary administrative intelligence who had essentially invented the machinery of the English Reformation without having any particular religious convictions himself. He was, at his core, a pragmatist. He believed in the Tudor state, in efficient government, in the expansion of royal power, and in his own survival. He had watched Wolsey fall and had learned the essential lesson: never put yourself in a position where your interests and the king's interests diverge, because when that happens, you lose. Anne, from Cromwell's perspective, had become a liability in exactly this way. She was too independent. She had her own agenda. She pushed back against Henry on matters of policy, and not always privately. She made enemies carelessly, not out of stupidity, but out of the particular impatience of someone who believed she was right and couldn't understand why the people around her failed to see it. By early 1536, Cromwell had concluded that Anne was more dangerous to him alive and powerful than removed. The question was how to remove her. He needed the king to want it, and Henry by this point did want it, or could be brought to want it with the right narrative supplied at the right moment. Cromwell began to assemble the case against Anne with the methodical efficiency of a man constructing a legal instrument. He gathered statements, he identified vulnerabilities, he found the men who would be accused alongside Anne, choosing people whose relationships with the Queen were visible enough to be made to look suspicious, whose positions made them useful targets, and whose own situations made them liable to breaking under pressure. The genius, if that word can be applied to something so monstrous, of Cromwell's construction was that it required no actual evidence of guilt. It required only the appearance of plausibility, and in a court where the king's will determined the outcome of any legal proceeding, plausibility was more than sufficient. Cromwell gave Henry a story. Henry chose to believe it, and Anne, who had built her entire position on understanding how power worked, found herself facing a machinery of destruction that she had helped, in the early years, to build. It is one of the more darkly ironic patterns in Tudor history that the woman who would succeed Anne Boleyn as queen had been a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, and was, at the time of Anne's crisis, serving as a lady-in-waiting to Anne herself. Jane Seymour was, by almost all contemporary accounts, quiet, pale, and studiously modest, qualities that, after years of Anne's sharp wit and political energy, Henry appears to have found profoundly restful. Where Anne had challenged him, debated him, and occasionally told him things he did not want to hear, Jane offered the complete absence of friction. She was coached by her ambitious family, particularly her brother Edward Seymour, in exactly how to capture Henry's attention while maintaining the appearance of virtue. She reportedly returned Henry's gifts and letters unread, declaring she had no greater treasure than her honour, a move that was either genuine or a very well executed copy of the tactic Anne herself had used a decade earlier. There is something almost vertiginously circular about the Jane Seymour situation, if you stop to look at it directly. Henry had pursued Anne by exactly the mechanism Jane was now using on him: the strategic refusal, the maintained distance, the suggestion of virtue too precious to compromise. He had spent 7 years being driven to distraction by a woman who wouldn't simply give him what he wanted, and here he was again, at 50, responding to the exact same dynamic with the exact same intensity. You would think a man of his experience would recognize the pattern. He did not. Or perhaps he did, and it worked on him anyway. The way certain songs keep working on you, even after you've heard them so many times, you should be immune. Jane was not stupid, whatever impression her carefully cultivated passivity may have given. She understood the court. She understood what Henry wanted in a wife at this particular moment, which was, essentially, everything Anne was not. Quiet, compliant, English, gentle, uncontroversial, and above all unchallenging. Anne had spent years pushing Henry toward religious reform, questioning his decisions, arguing her positions with energy and conviction. This was exhausting for a king who believed fundamentally in his own infallibility. Jane offered instead a mirror that only reflected what Henry wanted to see. Her family, the Seymours, were actively promoting her interests. They arranged for Jane to be positioned near Henry, for private moments to occur, for the appearance of a spontaneous connection to develop. This was court politics of the standard. Variety. Every ambitious family with a marriageable daughter near the king played this game, and the Seymours were simply better at it at the right moment than anyone else. They also had the enormous advantage of timing. Henry was restless, disillusioned, and looking for an exit from the marriage to Anne. Jane appeared in his line of sight at precisely the moment he needed something to appear there. Anne knew about Jane. It would have been impossible not to. The court was small, gossip was constant, and Jane was in Anne's own household. There are accounts of Anne discovering Henry giving Jane a locket, and of Anne pulling it so hard from Jane's neck that she cut her own fingers. Whether or not this specific incident is precisely accurate, the emotional reality it represents is almost certainly true. Anne watching the same mechanism that had elevated her being used against her and being powerless to stop it. In April of 1536, the walls closed in with a speed that astonished even people accustomed to Tudor court politics. Anne was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. She was also accused of conspiring to bring about the king's death. These charges were, to put it plainly, almost certainly fabricated, and historians across the centuries have been remarkably consistent in this view. The dates cited in the indictment placed Anne in locations where she demonstrably wasn't. The men accused alongside her included a court musician named Mark Smeaton, who confessed under what appears to have been torture, and several other courtiers whose relationships with Anne were, at most, the normal currency of flirtatious court banter that everyone engaged in, and that no one had ever treated as criminal before. The charges served Cromwell's purposes elegantly. They gave Henry a way to dissolve the marriage without repeating the long, humiliating public process of the previous annulment. They removed Anne without requiring the Pope's involvement, and they offered a narrative of betrayal that allowed Henry to cast himself as a wronged husband rather than a man abandoning a woman who had given him everything. Let's look at the specific charges, because they are worth examining. The indictment accused Anne of having committed adultery with Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and Mark Smeaton, all men of the Privy Chamber or close to it, as well as with her brother George Boleyn. The dates given in the indictment for these alleged encounters were specific, and in several cases Anne can be demonstrated from other documentary evidence to have been somewhere else entirely on the dates specified. This is not a subtle problem with the prosecution's case. It is the kind of problem that suggests either catastrophic incompetence in the preparation of the indictment or a process in which accuracy was simply not the point. The charge against George Boleyn was perhaps the most shocking. He was accused of incest with his own sister, a charge so extreme that it seems designed less to be believed than to be so horrifying that it overwhelmed rational evaluation. George's wife, Jane Boleyn, is said to have provided testimony that contributed to the case against him, though the exact nature of her involvement has been debated by historians at length. What is clear is that George was convicted on evidence that his contemporaries found thin, and that he maintained his innocence to the end with considerable composure. Mark Smeaton, the musician, was the only one of the accused men who confessed. He was also the only one who was not a gentleman, which meant he was the only one who could legally be subjected to physical coercion. His confession, obtained under circumstances that most historians regard as involving torture or its credible threat, did not exonerate the others. It simply gave the prosecution one statement of guilt to anchor the entire structure. Without Smeaton's confession, there was essentially nothing. With it, there was the appearance of a case. That appearance was sufficient. Anne Boleyn entered the Tower of London on the 2nd of May 1536, ironically, through the same gate she'd entered 3 years earlier as Queen, on the night before her coronation. She was, by multiple accounts, simultaneously terrified and extraordinary. The Constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, wrote detailed reports of her behaviour during her imprisonment, and what comes, through across 5 centuries, is the picture of a woman who knew she was going to die, and who was determined to face it with more dignity than the people around her could muster. She laughed. She wept. She made dark jokes about her neck. She said she had heard the executioner was very good, and he would have little trouble because she had a little neck. She went to the chapel and prayed. She ate when she could. She talked, at great length and with startling candour, about the king and the court and the relationships that had brought her here, a stream of consciousness that Kingston dutifully transcribed, and that reads, to modern eyes, like someone trying to outrun fear with words. Kingston's letters to Cromwell, written during Anne's imprisonment in the Tower, are among the most revealing documents of the entire affair. They were intended as intelligence reports. Cromwell wanted to know what Anne was saying, whether she was incriminating herself further, whether she was producing any information that could be used. What they inadvertently produced is something much more interesting. A portrait of a woman in extremis, unguarded in a way she had never been permitted to be in public, speaking with a strange, rambling honesty of someone who has moved past the point where self-protection is possible. She talked about Henry Norris, one of the accused men, and what she remembered saying to him in a conversation that had apparently been twisted into evidence against her. She talked about Francis Weston. She talked about the king. She said things that were unwise, and Kingston, to his credit, recorded them faithfully rather than editing them into something more manageable. The picture that emerges is of a woman who was neither the calculating schemer of Catholic propaganda nor the saintly martyr of Protestant hagiography, but something more human and more interesting than either, a person frightened, angry, grief-stricken, and fiercely alive, talking because silence was unbearable. She also received the sacraments repeatedly during her imprisonment. She swore on the Eucharist that she was innocent of the charges against her. In an age when such oaths were taken with absolute seriousness, when perjury before God was understood as a direct path to damnation, this matters. She was not performing innocence for an audience. She was declaring it to God, in private, in the full knowledge that she was about to die. Whatever else can be said about the charges against Anne Boleyn, this is a piece of evidence that the romantic tragedy version of her story gets right. She insisted, to the end and on her soul, that she was innocent. Anne Boleyn's trial took place on the 15th of May 1536 in the Great Hall of the Tower of London, before a jury of peers that included her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presiding. There were approximately 2,000 spectators. The charges were read. The evidence was presented, which is to say, the confessions obtained under duress, the testimony of witnesses who'd been carefully prepared, and the creaking skeleton of an indictment that fell apart on examination, but which no one in that room was actually required to examine. Anne defended herself with a clarity and composure that stunned observers. She addressed the charges one by one. She denied everything. She pointed out the inconsistencies in dates and locations. She spoke, reportedly, with such articulate force that even some of the men sitting in judgment appeared momentarily uncertain. And then the peers retired, deliberated for a very short period of time, and returned a verdict of guilty. Her brother George, tried separately on the same day, was also found guilty. The sentence was death. The trial of a Queen of England by a jury of peers was, in 1536, essentially without precedent. The procedural machinery had to be assembled specifically for this occasion, and the assembly of that machinery tells you something about the political intentions behind the event. The Duke of Norfolk, Anne's own uncle, presided as Lord High Steward, a man with no particular love for his niece, and every practical reason to ensure the verdict went the way the king needed it to go. The jury of 26 peers included men who owed their positions to Henry, men who had factional reasons to want Anne removed, and men who had no power to deliver any verdict other than the one that had been requested of them. George Boleyn's trial that same day produced one of the more remarkable episodes of the entire proceeding. He was handed a note containing details of an alleged conversation between Anne and Jane Boleyn, details so intimate and so damaging that the court clerk apparently did not want to read the note aloud. George was asked whether he knew the contents of the note and instructed to answer yes or no without reading it aloud. He read it aloud anyway. The note contained an accusation that Henry was sexually inadequate, impotent, or close to it. George's reading of the note in open court in front of 2,000 people was an act of either extraordinary courage or extraordinary recklessness, and probably both. It did not save him. But it ensured that the accusation, embarrassing to Henry, potentially destabilizing to the crown, was now public, now recorded, now part of the historical fabric of the trial. Anne, for her part, conducted her own defence with the forensic precision of someone who had thought through every charge and prepared her responses. She was not permitted counsel. She had no advance access to the specific evidence against her. She stood in that hall before 2,000 people and a jury that had been assembled to convict her, and she argued her case from memory and intelligence alone, pointing out the impossibilities in the timeline, the implausibility of the accusations, the absence of anything resembling actual evidence. It was, by the accounts of people who were there, a genuinely impressive performance, and it made no difference at all. 5 men were arrested alongside Anne and charged as her alleged lovers: Henry Norris, a senior courtier and close friend of the king; Francis Weston, a young member of the Privy Chamber; William Brereton, another Privy Chamber gentleman; the musician Mark Smeaton; and George Boleyn, Anne's own brother. The charge against George Boleyn included not just adultery but incest, a charge so grotesque that even in a court that had seen everything, it landed with a particular shock. George's wife, Jane Boleyn, appears to have provided some of the testimony against him, a fact that has made her one of the most debated and condemned figures in this entire story. All 5 men were executed on Tower Hill on the 17th of May, 2 days before Anne. They maintained their innocence, most of them. Mark Smeaton, the one who had confessed, did not explicitly recant at his death, which his contemporaries took as confirmation of his guilt, and which historians generally take as evidence that he understood a recantation would not save him, and would simply mean more pain. The execution of the 5 men on Tower Hill on the 17th of May was a public event, as all Tudor executions were, attended by crowds, witnessed by officials, and conducted with the particular formal gravity of a state ceremony that was, At the same time, something quite a lot more brutal. Henry Norris went first. He was one of the most senior men of the Privy Chamber, a man who had been close to Henry for years, a man who had been offered his life if he would confess and testify against Anne. He refused. He died maintaining his innocence, which tells you something about what he knew to be true. Francis Weston's case has always seemed to historians particularly striking. He was young, in his mid-20s, and his family had reportedly offered substantial sums of money to secure his release. The offer was declined. Weston wrote to his family before his death, a letter of such affecting simplicity that it has survived as a document of the period. He said he had thought little about death when he was young, and now thought of nothing else, and asked forgiveness for the life he had led. There is no confession in the letter, no admission of guilt, just the clear-eyed terror and regret of a young man who understands he's about to die for something he did not do. William Brereton is the figure about whom least is known and most is speculated. Some historians have suggested that his inclusion in the charges had less to do with any relationship with Anne and more to do with the fact that Cromwell had specific administrative reasons for wanting Brereton removed, that he had been an obstacle in certain Welsh governance matters that Cromwell was keen to resolve. If true, it means that at least one of the men who died alongside Anne was not even incidentally related to the case against her, but was simply a convenient addition to a list that was already being assembled for other reasons. Tudor politics could be that cold. George Boleyn's death, 2 days before his sister's, closed a chapter that had begun in the same household they had grown up in together at Hereford. He died, as he had lived, with a certain wry composure. His scaffold speech was measured, theologically cautious, and conspicuously free of confession. He asked God's forgiveness for his sins, as was conventional, but made no specific admission. He recommended himself to God. He was executed. Anne, in the Tower, was told he was dead. She said that she was glad that his suffering was over. The morning of Anne Boleyn's execution was a Friday. She had been told the day before. She had spent the night in what her attendants described as relative calm, praying, composing herself, making her final preparations with the focused attention of someone who understood that her last public appearance would be remembered. She dressed carefully in a dark grey gown of damask trimmed with fur, with a crimson petticoat beneath, colours that read, to Tudor eyes, as simultaneously elegant and penitential. She pinned her dark hair up beneath a gable hood, clearing her neck. The scaffold had been built within the Tower walls rather than on Tower Hill, which was an unusual kindness, restricting the spectacle to courtiers and officials rather than exposing her to the general public. A crowd of around 1,000 gathered. Henry was not present. He was reportedly already moving on. Anne received the sacrament early that morning, taking communion and swearing once more on the host itself that she was innocent of the charges against her. This was not a performative gesture. In the theology of the 16th century, receiving the Eucharist in a state of mortal sin was understood to be among the most dangerous spiritual acts a person could commit. To receive communion and swear falsely on it was to condemn your own soul. Anne knew this. The people around her knew this. She swore anyway, with the calm certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose except the truth, and was not willing to lose that. She walked to the scaffold with 4 of her ladies, women who had served her and who had been permitted as an act of mercy to attend her to the end. The walk from her lodgings to the scaffold was short. Contemporary accounts describe her as composed, her colour high, her movements controlled. She paused to speak to Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower who had been her jailer for the past 2 weeks, and who had, in his own way, treated her with a certain rough decency. She thanked him. He reportedly wept. On the scaffold she looked out at the assembled crowd, the lords, the officials, the curious and the horrified, and she spoke. Her voice was steady. This speech she gave was brief, carefully measured, and remarkable for what it contained and what it deliberately omitted. She praised Henry. She asked for prayers. She offered forgiveness to those who had condemned her. She said she came to die according to the law, and by the law she was judged. A formulation that neither accepted guilt nor directly accused her judges, but which carries, for anyone listening carefully, the particular weight of a woman saying the only true thing she was permitted to say. She then removed her gable hood herself, tucked her hair carefully beneath a linen cap, and knelt upright on the scaffold, not at the block, but simply kneeling, hands clasped, head held level. She began to pray aloud. Her ladies, weeping, stood nearby. One of them came forward and tied a blindfold across her eyes. Anne continued praying. The French swordsman, imported specifically because he was more skilled and more reliable than the standard English axeman, stepped forward. He spoke a word to distract her, and she turned her head slightly toward the sound. The sword came from the side, not from above, in a single swift arc. It was over in a moment. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was 35 years old. The watching crowd was almost entirely silent. Someone eventually wrapped her head in a cloth. There was no coffin. There had been no time, or no one had thought to order one. Anne Boleyn's scaffold speech is one of the most studied short texts in Tudor history, partly because of what it contains and partly because of what it conspicuously does not. The convention of scaffold speeches in this period was fairly fixed. You acknowledged the justice of the law, you asked for prayers, you said something mildly charitable about the king. Anne did all of this. She praised Henry as a most noble, gentle, gracious prince, words that read, depending on your interpretive generosity, as either genuine, coerced, strategically calculated, or devastatingly sardonic. She asked for prayers for herself. She did not confess. She did not admit to any of the crimes for which she'd been convicted. She asked God to save the king and to guide and preserve him. She said nothing about her daughter Elizabeth. She then knelt, and the French swordsman Henry had procured for the occasion, a merciful choice, as a skilled swordsman was far more reliable than an axe, completed the execution in a single stroke. The architecture of the speech repays close reading. Every scaffold speech in Tudor England was a negotiated performance. The condemned person understood that their family's future, their reputation, and sometimes the safety of people they loved depended on navigating the final public moment correctly. You could not attack the king. You could not declare your innocence too baldly, because that implied the king had murdered an innocent person, which was treasonous even in death. You had to find the narrow path between dignity and compliance, between truth and survival of everything you were leaving behind. Anne found that path with extraordinary precision. The praise of Henry as gracious and noble is so controlled, so formulaic, so perfectly calibrated to the requirements of the genre, that it tells us almost nothing about what she actually thought of him in those final hours. What it tells us is that she understood the rules and was choosing deliberately to play by them one last time, not because she feared death, but because she had a daughter. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. Her status, her safety, her future, all depended in part on what her mother said on that scaffold. Anne could not afford to die in a way that gave Henry reasons to punish the child further. She also said in the speech that she would accuse no one and speak no evil of others. This line has puzzled historians because it suggests there was evil she could have spoken, names she could have named, accusations she could have made. It is possible this is simply conventional rhetoric. It is also possible it is something else, a restrained, technically deniable indication that she knew exactly what had happened to her and who had made it happen, and was choosing in her final public act not to give them the satisfaction of her rage. The absence of any mention of Elizabeth is the most striking omission. Anne spoke of Henry, of God, of the law, of forgiveness. She didn't say her daughter's name. This may have been deliberate. Drawing attention to Elizabeth in that moment might have been read as a political act, a claim on the succession, a provocation, or it may have been something simpler and more human, that there are griefs too large for scaffold speeches, and the thought of her daughter was one of them. Anne Boleyn was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the Tower of London, in an arrow chest, because no one had thought to prepare a proper coffin. This detail, small and logistical and probably born of bureaucratic failure rather than deliberate cruelty, nevertheless says something about the speed and the atmosphere surrounding her end. She was laid in the chancel of the chapel near the altar without ceremony. No monument marked the spot. Henry married Jane Seymour 10 days later. The court moved on with the practised efficiency of people who had learned not to look backward in Tudor England. Catherine of Aragon, who had died in January of that same year, was buried at Peterborough Cathedral. The three women who had been, at various points, Queen of England, Catherine, Anne, and now Jane, had all left the stage within 6 months, and England blinked and kept going. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the name means St. Peter in chains, which is either grimly appropriate or simply a coincidence, depending on how you feel about historical irony, sits within the Tower complex, a small and ancient church that served the Tower community, and over the centuries became the burial place of a remarkable number of people who had died badly in proximity to royal power. Thomas More is buried there. John Fisher is buried there. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, would eventually be buried there, joining the woman whose execution Henry had also ordered a few years earlier. It is a building that holds, in its stones, a significant portion of Tudor England's capacity for self-destruction. Anne's remains were rediscovered during Victorian restoration work in the 1870s, when the chapel underwent renovation under the direction of the architect Anthony Salvin. The bones found in the chancel area were examined by a physician who estimated they were those of a woman of around 35 years, slight and fine-boned with a slender neck. Queen Victoria, who had developed a particular interest in Anne's story, ordered that the remains be given a proper reburial in an oak chest beneath the chancel floor, with a marble marker identifying the location. This Victorian marker is what visitors see today, a 19th century act of posthumous respect for a woman whose own century had provided neither coffin nor stone. Henry, in those days immediately following Anne's death, appears to have felt nothing that he allowed to be visible. He was seen in good spirits the evening of the execution. He was at Jane Seymour's house early the following morning. The marriage to Jane was announced within 24 hours and conducted within 11 days, a timeline so brisk that it dispels, fairly definitively, any notion that Henry had been a reluctant participant in what had just occurred. He wore white for Anne's execution, the colour of mourning in some traditions, which may have been pointed, or may have simply been what he reached for. He did not attend the burial. He did not order prayers said for her soul with any particular urgency. He moved forward with the momentum of a man who had decided that the chapter was closed and the next one was already beginning. This is the question historians have been arguing about for nearly 5 centuries, and the current scholarly consensus is relatively clear. Almost certainly not. The evidence against Anne Boleyn was thin, contradictory, and structurally dependent on the confession of one man who was tortured. The charges against George Boleyn were almost universally considered implausible even by contemporaries. The timing of the arrests coming precisely when Cromwell needed Anne removed, when Henry was besotted with Jane Seymour, and when the political logic of disposing of Anne without a repeat of the Catherine debacle was overwhelming, tells its own story. Modern historians, including Eric Ives, who produced the definitive biography of Anne, and more recently Gareth Russell and others, have largely concluded that the charges were fabricated or wildly exaggerated from trivial incidents of court flirtation assembled by Cromwell into something that could be called treason. The methodological argument is fairly straightforward. Start with the dates. The indictment specified dates and locations for the alleged encounters between Anne and the various men. Several of these dates can be checked against other documentary records, household accounts, court records, correspondence, and in a number of cases Anne can be placed elsewhere on the dates specified. Henry Norris was accused of adultery with Anne at a time when court records suggest he was not at the location cited. These are not ambiguities. They are errors so basic that they suggest either the people constructing the indictment were operating in extraordinary haste, or they simply did not expect anyone to check, because the outcome had already been determined. Then consider the social context. The relationships between Anne and the men accused alongside her were, in every documented instance, the entirely normal relationships of a Tudor court, flirtatious in the stylized, conventional way that courtly culture required, intellectually engaged, sometimes personally warm, but operating entirely within the understood grammar of courtly interaction that everyone at court participated in, and that had never previously been treated as criminal. Anne bantered with Henry Norris. She spoke warmly of Francis Weston. These were not secret communications. They happened in public, in the presence of dozens of witnesses, in a context where such banter was not just acceptable, but expected. The incest charge is perhaps the clearest evidence of fabrication, because it is the charge that makes the least sense even on its own terms. George Boleyn and Anne had grown up together, had been close in the way of siblings who had navigated a difficult court together, and had worked as political allies during Anne's queenship. The accusation that this relationship had been sexual was so extreme, so unsupported, and so useful, in the particular way that maximally horrifying charges are useful, because they tend to crowd out rational evaluation, that its primary function appears to have been rhetorical rather than evidentiary. It was designed to make people feel before they thought. What is perhaps most telling is the behaviour of the men who were offered their lives in exchange for testimony against Anne. Henry Norris was explicitly offered a pardon if he would confess and implicate the Queen. He refused. He chose death rather than false testimony. That is not the behaviour of a man who believes the charges are true and is calculating his odds. That is the behaviour of a man who knows the charges are false and will not compound the injustice by confirming them. It is impossible to understand Anne Boleyn fully without placing her inside the pattern of Henry's marriages, because that pattern is deeply revealing. Catherine of Aragon, faithful, dignified, and ruthlessly cast aside when she stopped being useful. Anne Boleyn, brilliant, politically engaged, and destroyed when she became a liability. Jane Seymour, gentle, compliant, died in childbirth after giving Henry the son he wanted, memorialised by Henry as his true love, possibly because she died before he could get tired of her. Anne of Cleves, rejected almost immediately on the basis that she failed to match her portrait, which is a very Henry thing to do. Catherine Howard, young, probably coerced, executed for alleged adultery. Catherine Parr, older, educated, survived by outlasting him. The through line is not love or even lust, it is utility. Each wife served a purpose and was retained or discarded according to how well she served it. Jane Seymour is the instructive counterexample, because she is the wife Henry idealised, and she was idealised, not coincidentally because she died. She gave birth to Edward, the longed-for male heir, in October 1537, and died 12 days later of what was probably puerperal fever. Henry wore black for months. He described Jane as his true wife at his own death. requesting to be buried beside her, a wish that was honoured. But historians have occasionally noted with a certain dry precision that Jane's extraordinary standing in Henry's posthumous estimation owed something to the fact that she never had the opportunity to disappoint him. She gave him a son, and she died. There was no subsequent chapter in which Henry grew restless, no miscarriages, no arguments about church policy, no inconvenient intelligence. She remained permanently in the configuration that had pleased him most. Anne of Cleves provides a different kind of illumination. Henry had agreed to the marriage on the basis of a portrait by Hans Holbein, a portrait that was, by most accounts, flattering but not dishonest. When Anne arrived in England and Henry met her ahead of the formal reception, he was disappointed immediately and with great thoroughness. He described her as a Flanders mare. He married her anyway because the diplomatic machinery was already in motion, but the marriage was never consummated and was annulled within 6 months. Anne of Cleves, displaying a political intelligence that Henry perhaps underestimated, accepted the annulment graciously, took the generous settlement she was offered, and lived out a comfortable life in England as the king's beloved sister. She outlived Henry by 10 years, which is arguably the best outcome any of his wives achieved. Catherine Howard was probably around 17 when she married Henry, who was nearly 50 and in declining health. She was manipulated by her own family, poorly educated, and entirely unequipped for the political demands of the position she had been placed in. Her execution in 1542 on charges of adultery followed a pattern disturbingly similar to Anne's: speed, thin evidence, and a king who needed an exit. Catherine Parr, the final wife, was 42 when Henry died and had survived partly through genuine intelligence and partly through the simple advantage of his deteriorating health running out before his patients did. The pattern, laid out this way, is not a love story. It is a study in power and what happens to people, particularly women, who stand too close to its centre for too long. Here is the part of Anne, Boleyn's legacy that gets consistently underplayed in the romantic tragedy version of her story. She accomplished things. Real, lasting, historically significant things. Her influence contributed substantially to the direction of the English Reformation, not just as a passive object of Henry's affections, but as someone with genuine theological and intellectual commitments who used her position to advance reformist clergy, protect reformist thinkers, and push for scripture in English. She supported Nicholas Shaxton, Hugh Latimer, and Thomas Cranmer, men who had shaped the Church of England for generations. She was instrumental in promoting the circulation of Tyndale's English Bible. She used her queenship to advocate for the poor, specifically pushing for the redirection of dissolved monastery funds toward education and charitable relief. She was, by the evidence of people who worked with her, not merely a symbol, but an actor. The case of William Tyndale is worth dwelling on, because it illustrates the real stakes of Anne's reformist commitments. Tyndale was an English scholar who had translated the New Testament into English, a project that the Catholic Church, and initially Henry himself, regarded as deeply dangerous. The idea that ordinary people should be able to read scripture in their own language was threatening to an institution whose authority rested in significant part on its monopoly over biblical interpretation. Tyndale had fled England to avoid prosecution, continued his work on the continent, and was eventually betrayed, arrested, strangled, and burned in Belgium in 1536, the same year Anne was executed. Anne had owned his work. She had annotated it. She had placed it in Henry's hands and encouraged him to read it. The theological world she was pushing Henry toward was one in which Tyndale's vision would eventually become official policy. The Great Bible of 1539, the first authorized English Bible, was a direct descendant of Tyndale's translation, produced in significant part because of the intellectual groundwork Anne had laid. Her patronage of Hugh Latimer is similarly significant. Latimer was a preacher of remarkable power and reformist conviction who would go on to become one of the central figures of the English Reformation, and who would eventually be burned at the stake under Mary I, dying with the famous words that he and his fellow martyr were lighting a candle in England that would never be put out. Anne spotted him early, protected him when his preaching attracted hostile attention, and helped engineer his appointment as Bishop of Worcester. Without her patronage, his career might have been extinguished before it had the chance to become historically significant. She also used her position to intervene directly in the question of what happened to the money from the dissolved monasteries. Cromwell and Henry's instinct was to funnel the proceeds into the royal treasury. Anne pushed back, arguing that the resources should be redirected towards schools, colleges, and relief for the poor. She did not win this argument. The treasury got the money, but the fact that she made it consistently and with evident conviction tells us something important about the nature of her reformism. It was not simply anti-papal. It was not simply a matter of personal theology. It was connected to a vision of what a reformed church should do in the world, and that vision included genuine concern for people at the bottom of Tudor society. Whatever Henry intended when he had Anne executed, he did not intend to produce a legend. But the child Anne had given birth to in 1533, the daughter whose gender had seemed at the time like a catastrophic disappointment, grew up to become Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the most celebrated monarch in English history, the woman who presided over the Renaissance flowering of English literature, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and the establishment of England as a major European power. Elizabeth inherited her mother's dark eyes, her quick intelligence, her fierce political instincts, and her absolute refusal to be managed by men who thought they knew better. Elizabeth almost never spoke of Anne publicly. The circumstances of her mother's death were too politically complicated, too raw, too potentially destabilizing. But she kept a ring that contained a miniature portrait of Anne, worn close to her until her death. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old when her mother was executed. She was too young to remember the execution itself, too young to have any conscious memory of Anne's presence at court, too young for anything except the sudden, inexplicable absence of a mother she had barely had the chance to know. She was declared illegitimate shortly after Anne's death, Henry's marriages having a way of retroactively invalidating his children's status when they became inconvenient, and her household was reduced and her position at court diminished. She was not quite 6 when Jane Seymour died giving birth to Edward. She was not quite 10 when Catherine Howard was executed. By the time she was a teenager, Elizabeth had watched her father execute 2 of his wives and had developed, from the evidence of her subsequent behaviour, a very clear and permanent understanding of what proximity to royal power without adequate protection could do to a person. She was educated brilliantly, she spoke 6 languages, she read Greek and Latin, she studied history and rhetoric and theology with a seriousness that her tutors found remarkable. She appears to have known, from a fairly early age, that her intelligence was both her most valuable asset and her greatest source of danger, and she developed the particular discipline of a person who has learned that survival requires knowing exactly how much of yourself to reveal and when. This is Anne's lesson carried into the next generation. Hold back, watch the room, give them just enough, and no more. When Elizabeth finally came to the throne in 1558, at the age of 25, she began a reign that would last 44 years and that would redefine what English monarchy could be. She never married, a decision that puzzled, frustrated, and occasionally terrified her advisers, who could not understand why a queen would refuse the obvious security of a royal alliance and a male heir. Elizabeth understood something they did not or would not admit, that marriage, for a woman with power, was not protection. Her mother's story had told her so. Her own story confirmed it at every turn. She held the power herself. She did not divide it. Anne Boleyn in death became something her enemies cannot have intended. A martyr, then a romantic heroine, then a symbol, then a cottage industry. Within decades of her execution, Protestant writers and propagandists had begun constructing a version of Anne as a godly woman destroyed by Catholic reaction, a Reformation saint who died for her beliefs. John Foxe, in his enormously influential Acts and Monuments, known popularly as Foxe's Book of Martyrs, gave Anne a prominent place in the narrative of English Protestant suffering. She was recast, reshaped, and repositioned again and again by each generation that encountered her story. The 19th century made her a romantic tragedy. The 20th century made her a feminist icon. The 21st century has produced approximately 10,000 historical novels, 4 major film or television adaptations, and an ongoing argument in academic journals about whether she was primarily a political actor, a religious reformer, a victim of misogynist paranoia, or some irreducible combination of all three. Foxe's treatment of Anne is fascinating partly for what it emphasises and partly for what it quietly adjusts. In his telling, Anne becomes almost primarily a religious figure. Her court connections, her political manoeuvres, her years of strategic positioning all subordinated to the narrative of a woman whose faith brought her into conflict with Catholic power and who paid for it with her life. This version of Anne served Protestant England's need for martyrs and founding stories, and it was enormously influential in shaping how ordinary English people understood the Reformation and their own religious history. It was also, like all hagiography, selective. The Anne of Foxe's martyrology is saintly in a way that the Anne of Kingston's Tower Letters, the one making dark jokes about her neck, is emphatically not. The 19th century discovered Anne through the Romantic movement's fascination with tragic queens, doomed heroines, and the dramatic possibilities of Tudor history. She appeared in plays, in novels, in paintings. She was painted as dark and beautiful and wronged, a figure of passionate suffering that the Victorian sensibility found both thrilling and morally instructive. The image of Anne that most people carry today, the one with the dark eyes and the knowing expression, the one that looks as though she understands exactly what is coming, derives substantially from this period's artistic production, even when the specific works have been forgotten. The 20th and 21st centuries have added feminist readings that the previous centuries couldn't quite have articulated, but that illuminate something that was always there. That Anne's story is, among other things, a story about what happens to women who reach for power in systems not designed to accommodate them. She is claimed now, by people across a remarkable range of interpretive positions, as a Protestant hero, as a proto-feminist, as a victim of patriarchy, as a cautionary tale, as an inspiration. The range of things Anne Boleyn is made to mean, across 5 centuries, is itself a kind of testimony to how much she managed to pack into 35 years of life, and 2 years, and 8 months of queenship. Let's spend a moment with the misconceptions, because there are so many good ones. Anne Boleyn was not a scheming temptress who deliberately set out to seduce a king and break up a marriage. The evidence suggests she was initially resistant to Henry's attentions and that the relationship evolved over years. She was not responsible for the English Reformation in some simple causal sense. The theological and political forces driving English church reform were already in motion and would have found their path with or without her. She did not have a 6th finger, a goiter, a deformed hand, or any of the other physical abnormalities her enemies catalogued. These were slanders, most of them originated by hostile Catholic sources writing after her death, and with an obvious interest in blackening her reputation. She was almost certainly not guilty of adultery with any of the men accused alongside her. and she was not, in any straightforward sense, a social climber who brought down her own destruction through overreach. She was a woman playing the only game available to her by the rules she'd been given, in a court that could change those rules overnight. The Sixth Finger story deserves a particular moment because it has proven remarkably durable across 5 centuries of retelling. The source is Nicholas Sander, a Catholic polemicist writing in the 1570s, nearly 40 years after Anne's death, in exile, with an obvious agenda and with access to precisely no reliable first-hand evidence about Anne's physical appearance. Zander described Anne as having a projecting tooth, a wen under her chin, a sallow complexion, and a 6th fingernail on one hand. These physical descriptions were picked up, repeated, and eventually became standard elements of the Anne Boleyn mythology, despite the fact that they contradict virtually every other surviving description of her, and were produced by someone who never met her and was being paid, essentially, to make her look bad. The portrait of Anne as a physical grotesque served Catholic propaganda's purposes neatly. It explained how Henry could have been infatuated with her only by suggesting supernatural intervention, witchcraft specifically, which was the charge her enemies loved to gesture toward without quite having to make directly. The witchcraft suggestion is equally durable and equally groundless. The idea that Anne bewitched Henry, that his passion for her was supernatural rather than the straightforward result of a charismatic, intelligent, unusually educated woman declining to be his mistress in an era when that was enough to drive a king to distraction, served obvious narrative purposes. It removed agency from both parties. It made Henry a victim and Anne a villain, which was enormously convenient for people who wanted to criticise the Reformation without criticising the king who had made it happen. It also conveniently explained something that the straightforward version of events makes uncomfortably clear, that Henry was capable of destroying people, including people he had once loved, with very little provocation and even less remorse, and that this was a feature of his character rather than evidence of supernatural interference. What the misconceptions collectively reveal is the degree to which Anne has always been made to carry meanings that serve other people's agendas. She is the temptress when the Reformation needs a human cause rather than a structural one. She is the martyr when Protestantism needs founding saints. She is the tragic victim when history needs a morality tale. She's rarely simply herself, a specific person, in a specific historical moment, making specific choices under specific constraints, with specific consequences. Getting her back to that person is what good history does, and what 5 centuries of mythology has made surprisingly difficult. There is a reason Anne Boleyn refuses to stay in the past where history is supposed to keep its subjects. She endures because her story is, in some very fundamental way, not just a Tudor story. It is a story about what happens to ambitious women in systems that simultaneously need their gifts and resent their agency. It is a story about the gap between what a woman is told she can achieve and the specific, brutal moment when the system decides she has gone too far. Anne used every tool available to her: intelligence, charm, education, political instinct, spiritual conviction, to build something extraordinary, and then watched it destroyed by a coalition of interests that found her presence inconvenient. The specific vocabulary changes, wives and queens are not our categories anymore, but the underlying geometry of the story is not as foreign as we might like it to be. Anne Boleyn spent her life being told she was too much, too clever, too French, too outspoken, too theologically engaged, too politically active, too unwilling to disappear quietly. She spent her death being told she'd never been anything at all. What makes her story genuinely instructive, rather than merely tragic, is the specificity of the mechanisms that destroyed her. It was not simply that Henry decided he wanted a new wife. It was that a specific man, Cromwell, identified that Anne's removal served his interests, identified the vulnerabilities in her position, and built a legal and political apparatus designed to destroy her that operated with the impersonal efficiency of a machine. The charges were not believed, even by many of the people who acted on them. The trial was not designed to find truth. The verdict was not a judgment, it was an instrument, and the entire structure was held together by the willingness of a king to accept a convenient narrative rather than demand an inconvenient truth. There is nothing in this that requires medieval cruelty to explain. The components are entirely familiar. They have been used before and since. She also matters because of what came after, because the daughter she left behind at 2 years old grew up to be Elizabeth I, and because Elizabeth's reign was shaped in ways that are visible if you know where to look, by everything Anne had been and done and suffered. Elizabeth's ferocious intelligence, her refusal to marry, her insistence on controlling her own political destiny, her particular combination of personal warmth and strategic calculation. These are not simply Elizabeth's own characteristics. They are in part the inheritance of a woman who demonstrated at considerable cost what happened when those qualities were deployed without the protection of a crown that was truly yours. Elizabeth had that protection. She made sure of it. Anne Boleyn changed England. She did not plan to change England, not exactly. She planned to survive, to secure her position, to give Henry a son, to advance the causes she believed in. But the changes came anyway, carried in the wake of the decisions she made and the decisions that were made about her. The English Reformation moved in the direction she pushed it. The English Bible reached ordinary hands partly because she put it in a king's. The greatest monarch England arguably ever produced was her daughter, and 5 centuries later, her story is still being told, still being argued over, still being reinterpreted, still generating new books and films and academic papers and late-night arguments about what she was really like and what really happened, and whether it could have gone differently. She was 35 years old when she died, in a courtyard inside a medieval fortress, on a Friday morning in May, with her hair pinned up and her neck bare and her composure, by all accounts, absolutely intact. She'd held herself together across everything: the years of waiting, the coronation, the pregnancies, the miscarriages, the unravelling, the tower, the trial, the scaffold. She held herself together to the last moment, and then the sword came, and the story that cannot be stopped was only beginning. Anne Boleyn did not move through Tudor history alone. She was surrounded always by women, ladies-in-waiting, gentlewomen, attendants, companions, who dressed her, served her, watched her, and in some cases outlived her by decades. These women are the shadows at the edges of her portrait, mentioned in passing when they are useful to the narrative and ignored when they are not. But they saw everything. They were present in the bedchamber when the miscarriages happened. They were in the room when Henry's visits grew shorter and colder. They attended her in the Tower during those final weeks. They stood on the scaffold and watched her die. And then, because survival in Tudor England required it, most of them went on to serve the next queen, and the one after that, carrying what they had witnessed in silence for the rest of their lives. They are in many ways the most honest witnesses to Anne's story, and almost none of them left a record we can read directly. The ladies-in-waiting of a Tudor queen occupied a position of extraordinary intimacy and extraordinary vulnerability simultaneously. They were with the queen constantly, helping her dress, accompanying her to chapel, sitting with her during meals, sleeping in her chambers or adjacent to them. They heard conversations not intended for wider audiences. They observed the marriage at close range. They knew from the quality of the silences between the royal couple, from the expression on the king's face when he departed, from the way Anne held herself after certain visitors left, what the public version of the marriage carefully concealed. They knew things that could get them killed, and the ones who survived mostly understood this. Anne Boleyn herself had served as a lady-in-waiting, first to Margaret of Austria, then to Queen Claude, then to Catherine of Aragon herself. She understood the role from the inside, which meant she understood its particular combination of proximity and powerlessness. You were close to power without possessing it. You were trusted with intimacy without being protected by it. You were useful until you weren't, and the line between confidant and liability was thinner than the fabric of a court gown. Some of her ladies were genuinely loyal to her. 4 of them, their names recorded as Mary Kingston, Mary Norris, Anne Savage, and Elizabeth Wood, though the precise identities are debated, were permitted to attend Anne to the scaffold, which was itself an act of mercy granted by Henry or by the Tower authorities, and which suggests that their loyalty to Anne was considered established enough to be worth noting. They stood on that scaffold and watched, and whatever they carried from that morning they carried privately, because the world they returned to after the execution was still Henry's world, and Anne was already being erased from it. Jane Boleyn, George Boleyn's wife, Anne's sister-in-law, is the figure whose role in the proceedings has generated the most historical controversy and the most moral condemnation. She appears to have provided testimony that contributed to the case against both Anne and George. Why she did this is genuinely uncertain. Fear, coercion, genuine belief in the charges, personal resentment toward her husband, calculation about her own survival. All of these have been proposed. None can be definitively confirmed. What can be confirmed is that her survival after Anne's fall was temporary. She was herself executed in 1542, following the fall of Catherine Howard, having served as a go-between in the young Queen's alleged affair. History does not always arrange itself into clean moral lessons, but occasionally it comes close. The women who surrounded Anne, who served her and watched her and survived her, carry in their silence a testimony we cannot fully hear. They knew the truth of what the Queen's days actually contained, the courage and the fear, the grief and the defiance, the moments when the composure slipped and the human being underneath it was briefly visible. They took most of that knowledge with them, but they were there, and that fact sitting quietly in the margins of the historical record is its own kind of witness. History remembers Anne Boleyn for how her story ended, which means it consistently underestimates what her story might have become. She was 35 years old. By Tudor standards, that was not young, it was solidly middle-aged, an age by which many of her contemporaries had already died of illness, childbirth, or the general hostility of the era. But 35 was also not old enough to foreclose possibility. Catherine of Aragon had lived to 50. Margaret of Austria had governed until 60. Catherine Parr, Henry's final wife, would survive to 36 and would have lived longer without the complications of a final ill-advised marriage. Anne Boleyn in another history, in a history where the charges against her were not fabricated, and the king's interest was not captured by a quieter woman at precisely the wrong moment, might have had another 20 years. The question of what she would have done with them is not merely speculative. It is a way of understanding what she actually was. She would, in all likelihood, have continued pushing the English Reformation in a more thoroughgoing direction than it ultimately took. The Reformation under Henry, without Anne's influence, became something considerably more conservative than what the reformist circle she had cultivated was hoping for. The theology shifting in fits and starts, the dissolution of the monasteries proceeding more as a revenue exercise than a spiritual renewal, the distribution of scripture in English advancing, but the deeper structural reforms Anne had envisioned remaining largely unrealised. With Anne alive and influential, the trajectory might have bent differently. The scholars and clergymen she had patronised would have had continued access to royal favour. The arguments for genuine church renewal rather than merely political separation from Rome would have had an articulate, determined and well-positioned advocate. She might have had more children. This is the aspect of the hypothetical that is most straightforward and, in terms of English history, most consequential. If Anne had produced a male heir, and there is no medical reason to assume she could not have, given that she had carried at least 3 pregnancies to a point of developmental viability, the entire subsequent history of the Tudor dynasty reshapes itself. No Edward dying young, no Mary's Catholic restoration, no Elizabeth's particular, solitary, magnificent reign. The England of Elizabeth I exists in significant part because Anne Boleyn did not produce a son, and because the absence of that son was used against her. In a history where she had produced one, she might be remembered primarily as the mother of a long-reigning king, and the drama of her early years might have settled into the footnotes of a more stable narrative. She would certainly have continued to be difficult in the particular way that people with genuine convictions and genuine intelligence are difficult in environments that reward compliance. She would have argued with Henry. She would have pushed against the constraints of the role, just as she had always pushed against them. She would have made enemies and kept them, the way people do when they refuse to be managed. She might eventually have exhausted Henry's patience through entirely legitimate means, through the ordinary friction of a long marriage between 2 strong-willed people, and landed in a situation that was politically difficult without being fatal. Or she might have found, as some queens did, a way to convert proximity to power into a form of durable influence that outlasted the volatile affections of the man she'd married. We do not know. We cannot know. The sword came on a Friday morning in May and closed the question permanently, but the act of asking it, of taking Anne seriously enough to imagine her future, rather than just mourning her end, is itself a form of respect that 5 centuries of mythology have not always managed to pay her. She was not only a story about what happened to her, she was a person who happened to history, and the shape of the world she left behind is the clearest evidence we have of what she was capable of. Imagine, then, what she might have done with more time. The answer, whatever form it took, would almost certainly have been extraordinary. And so here we are, at the end of a life that was 35 years long and 5 centuries wide. You have travelled tonight through the courts of Europe and the corridors of a Tudor palace. You have watched a girl from Kent absorb the lessons of the most sophisticated courts in the world and carry them home like a lit match into a room full of dry timber. You have watched her hold a king at arm's length for 7 years, reshape the religious architecture of an entire country, wear a crown for 1,000 days, lose 3 pregnancies, survive a court of enemies who wanted her gone before she'd properly arrived, walk to a scaffold on a Friday morning in May and face the blade with her hair pinned up and her composure, by every account, absolutely intact. She was not the witch her enemies called her. She was not quite the saint her Protestant admirers made her. She was sharper than the romantic tragedy version allows, and more human than the political symbol version admits. She was a woman who understood power and pursued it with clear eyes, who had genuine convictions and acted on them at genuine cost, who loved her daughter and could not protect her, who swore her innocence on the Eucharist in a cold stone room, and was executed for crimes she almost certainly did not commit by a system that had already decided it did not need her anymore. There is grief in that. There is also something else, something that refuses to be only grief, because Anne Boleyn lost everything, and still, somehow, won the longest game. The daughter she left behind at 2 years old ruled England for 44 years and became the monarch her century is named after. The English Bible she pressed into a king's hands eventually reached every parish in the country. The reformers she sheltered and promoted shaped a church that endured, and her own story, the one they tried to end on a scaffold and bury in an arrow chest without a coffin, has been retold and re-examined and argued over and reimagined for 500 years without showing any sign of exhaustion. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your warm bed, with your indoor plumbing and your painkillers, and your absolute freedom to read whatever book you like without being executed for it, maybe spare a quiet thought for the woman in the grey damask gown. For everyone who has ever been told they were too much and refused to believe it. For everyone who played a rigged game with everything they had and changed the world anyway, even when the world did not say thank you. History is full of people who were erased by the people who feared them. Anne Boleyn is proof that erasure does not always work. Sometimes the ones they try to silence are the ones who keep speaking, through their children, through the institutions they shaped, through the stories that will not stay buried no matter how shallow the grave. Rest now. The candles are out. The court is quiet. The tower is dark. She is not forgotten. She never was.